Welcome to another edition of Chicago Crossing Model Railroad at the Bench. It's me, Eric, here with you as always. I've been working on this rooftop to a DPM kit that I've had since maybe about 2017. I built it back then. It looked completely boring, and so I've been redoing it. You know, a small railroad like Chicago Crossing has maybe a total of 20 or so buildings on it. And if you come back to buildings that you've constructed or any element that is on the railroad, you'll never run out of models, no matter how long you are in the hobby, because you'll always find new things to do with old models. So you can zip up the wallet, spend the time to go back and rehabilitate things. This is what is commonly referred to as a roll roof. Basically, on the base of the roof, what it more or less amounts to, tar paper gets rolled out and torched down to adhere to the surface of the roof. Then a lot of times between these rolls, even though they'll often overlap, there will be sealant applied. And that sealant helps to make sure that the surface remains watertight. On this structure, the material that I've used to fashion this is actually just some pre-made stuff I've had by RS Laser Kits. It's literally 3-foot scale pieces of what really amounts to being like essentially construction paper or something similar. You don't need to buy pre-made stuff. You can use almost any material to make those rolls. Paper is usually a good one. And then you just need a scale. And that scale can get you the size that you need. Since I had this, I figured I'd use it. So as you can see, it's matte medium used to adhere this. And I basically just lined it up on one side and then cut away everything once the paper dried. It's easy enough to do. Once that paper is down, then what I did is I modeled the sealant that is placed between the tar paper rolls here. That's basically nothing other than a little bit of dark gray. I don't use black. And it's simply because very few things in the real world are actually true black. I find using very dark colors is great. Black, never, except as something to mix in to change the shades of different paints. You know, all these little furniture items on the top of a roof like this are just as important as a storytelling mechanism as the material, say, that the roof is made of. Keeping in mind the era of the building is important, because then all of this stuff becomes a nice telltale as to what era that building is in and what shape that building is in. You know, rooftop furniture like this are models just as much as the building is. It's important, at least in my opinion, not to treat them like an afterthought. And for that reason, making sure that everything you do up here really fits in with your skill level and with your willingness to take the time and do a good job, I think is just a helpful mindset to make sure that both you and the others who see your layout really can get a lot from it visually. So these elements here are all 3D prints. I don't have my own 3D printer currently because I have no place to put one, especially with the fumes that a resin printer creates. So that's an ongoing quest, but in the meantime, this is all 3D printed resin plastic, so all of this gets assembled as a pre-assembly first. That's just using plain old CA in order to adhere everything together. You know, I've talked before about Chicago Crossing's color palette, and it's just as true here as anywhere. Everything that I build gets a base coat of XF69, that is NATO black. That is the foundation color for all of the different models on Chicago Crossing. And so what it does is, number one, it puts a good layer of paint down there, but number two, it installs the shadows on top of the model so that everything after that is more about how the sun or the ambient light hits the object than about trying to paint the object. Everything has a color, but everything is also a mix of light and shadow. And so what we're trying to do here is to create the illusion, particularly in really small objects, that there actually is a degree of shadow to them. I have what essentially would be a color palette for air conditioning units on Chicago Crossing. That palette is beyond the NATO black coating, is sky gray XF19, which is what I've used here. You can't quite tell because there's a lot of weathering on here to make this thing a little bit more crusty and junky than a brand new unit. You can also use Japanese Navy gray, Japanese Army gray. I've used sky before as well. And those are kind of these light painted colors that you will often see these units being. So what I don't ever use on these is, a metallic paint. From this distance, the supposed viewing distance for an N-scale model, there are really very few things that are truly going to be metallic. And almost always, these types of air conditioning units are made of galvanized metal. That is either naked, in which case it's more of just a gray or a gray blue, or it is painted, in which case it's one of the colors here that I will typically use. You can use off-whites and things like that as well, but that's kind of what I choose. So with that in mind, everything after that is about exposing the light and exposing the color of this. The other colors up here are for things like discoloring the air conditioning vents and ductwork. This is basically a stone gray. This is olive drab. And those were used in essence as dry brushing on particularly this air conditioning unit, almost just to introduce a certain level of discoloration of the paint. You can kind of see it here. Likewise, a lot of this metal will begin to rust, particularly where water collects at seams. And so the best chipping color that I have is this German black-brown color. It's another Vallejo model color. So for the dark paint chips, that's basically just sponge application and just very light touching to the model itself. And that can provide these tiny little, almost sometimes imperceptible chips that you see throughout. And where those can be applied is where there is pooling of water and rust over here, or just edges over here. The way to kind of think about rust is basically first the paint fades off, then you start to get corrosion, and then you have areas where that corrosion becomes, more and more severe or even older, so to speak. The other element of that is where, paint is basically chipped off through wear and tear or banging into an object or whatever it is. Those two forms of rust are really common in the armor modeling world, and you can watch a lot of videos of experts do that type of, paint chipping, as well as using wet on wet or wash approaches to generate these little pools where you think rust might be. And rust tends to work from kind of a lighter, where you have the paint begin to fade, to a lighter rust, to then a darker area of corrosion, because that typically means water is pooling somewhere. And where water pools, higher levels of corrosion will occur. So it's sort of like a beach, and the deeper the water, the deeper the corrosion will be. So we'll talk a little bit about painting and weathering this rooftop material. And I can't say I'm fully finished with the process here, but you can see in my hand is a piece of that sort of naked material, no weathering on it or anything like that. What I have done before actually applying this weathering is to seal it. And so what that sealant is on the one hand, matte medium that you saw me place on top, and then the other hand is I basically just clear coat everything in order to make sure that all of this paper, since this is paper, it gets wet, it will break down, stays in place, and stays the way that I want it to be. It's also worth considering, if you have modern HVAC, where the condenser unit is that might be leaking water into a pool on the roof. I use a combination of colors, including very dark browns, umbers, greens, and grays, to create a ponding effect, as if this is where standing water moves, where moss grows, and where it ultimately collects. And then I use that light gray as a little bit of almost a tide mark as to how that pond grows and shrinks. If you want to actually show a little bit of dripping water there, you can put on a little bit of a gloss material. What I have used is just a micro gloss. And so you can take that material, you can take micro gloss and you can more or less just pond it onto an area that you want to show as being, a water collection site. And I try to just make sure that this material doesn't take up a three-dimensional sort of space. That's actually kind of important because 3 dimensions for dripping water has a height that you don't want to have on a roof. You don't want it to make it seem as if a liquid is higher up than the sort of bowl that it is pouring into on the roof. The nice thing about sealing this with a clear coat is that the paper is not going to absorb this material. And that is, once again, important for being able to achieve that effect. Well, that looks like about enough for this particular roof, at least for now. Once the building is further constructed, who knows? Maybe there are some additional elements that can go onto here. But in general, I think this offers some perspective on how to use roof details in a way that help to create a scene that is compelling and interesting to the eye. All right. With that, have a good rest of the weekend and talk again soon.